Okay, so welcome back. So in the last video, we looked at the wrong way of trying to update our state. And to recap, notice that it doesn't work. So obviously we need to fix this. So let's look at the solution. Okay. All right, and before we actually jump into the solution, I want to quickly recap some basic knowledge. I'll be talking about array destructuring, and that's just a simple way, if you recall, whereby we can get the elements from an array. So if I have an array having these three elements, I could get them one by one, fruits 0, 1, 2, 3, right? Assign each one to a variable. We've done this before. However, I can accomplish the same thing using a more efficient manner, whereby I specify the name of the array, and to the left hand side, I simply specify three variable names. And what will happen? The elements in the array will be assigned one by one to each variable. So this way is simply called destructuring. So whenever I mention array destructuring, this is what I mention. Okay, and so we tend to do this approach quite often. Okay, with that out of the way, let's get to it. So we want to actually use the useState React hook or function, and the way we do that is by simply using the function useState. Now this function expects an argument, which is the initial state. Okay, and so if you recall, here when we created a variable count, we set it to 0. So that's what I mean by the initial state. Now for us to use the useState hook, we need to actually import it from the React package. And after we call this function, it returns an array that contains two elements, right? The first element will be a variable that will be used for the state. And the second element will be a function, okay, which we call a set function, that will be used to actually update that first element, okay, to update the state. Okay, if you hear any noise, sorry for the background noise. Once we have those two pieces of information, right, the actual state and the set function to update that state, then we can go ahead and use those two things to actually update our state the right way. Now, a bit of warning, and you'll see more of this later on. You can only use the useState hook in specific areas, okay? And you'll notice I say top level. That simply means that I cannot put them inside of a loop or inside of a conditional, or maybe inside of some other function that is inside our component. So how do we actually use this useState React hook or function? So what we do, we call the function, we have the initial value, and then of course an equal sign, and then since it returns two elements, it returns an array with two elements, we simply use array destructuring, which we looked at earlier, to store those two return values. One of them again is a variable, the other one is a function that updates that variable. Now, we can use whatever names we want. However, we tend to use the name of the variable, and then for the function, we use the word set in front. All right, that seems to be the pattern, or that is the accepted pattern. Now, once we have this set up, and notice I put it as the first thing, all right? So it's not inside this second function here. It's not inside my return. It's at the top, okay? It's at the top level. That's what I mean by top level. Now, once I have this set up, I can then go ahead and use the setCount function to do the actual updating. So whenever I want my count, my state to actually change, I will have to call the function, and then the argument I give to it is simply what I want this new state variable, what I want count to become. And here I'm saying that I want it to become what it was plus 1. And that's it. That's how we update the state. We must do it through the function. Now once we've done that, then obviously in step 3 we can go ahead and use the variable, and it should be the appropriate, or it should be the correctly updated value. So why does it re-render? Well, whenever React sees the set function, the set count function, whenever it executes it, it knows that it needs to re-render this component. All right. Now, again, you should not create state inside conditionals, inside loops, or inside functions that are inside the component. All right. So let's look at that in code. All right. So again, we know that this is not working. All right. So let's update our code to actually make our component re-render. So we don't need this anymore. We don't need this. And so the first thing I want to do up here is to import the useState functionality. So I'm going to say import useState from React. Okay, and then the first thing I'm going to do is to set up the state. So I know that it's going to be called useState. It needs an initial value, so we're going to set count to be 0, okay, or whatever is returned to me to be 0. And then of course, since I know it's an array and I'm doing array destructuring, I will simply use 2 square brackets, and I'm going to call the state variable count and the function that updates that variable set count. Again, the names are up to you. Okay, now once we have this set up, we can go in here inside our increment count function and simply update count. And again, to update count, we must use the function. So what do I want count to be when this function is triggered? I want it to be the whole count plus 1. And that's it. So now whenever I use count, I should see my value being incremented. Let's save this. It should be updated. Let me go back. Let's refresh. Okay, good. So notice it does render the first the app component as usual, and it renders the counter component. Now let's see if it re-renders the counter component again. So if I click here, see it's 1. So notice down here we have another render the counter component being printed, which tells me that the set count function is doing its job. It's updating count, and because it's updating count, that's a trigger to React to also re-render the component, which essentially means calling this counter function again. And because we call this function again, obviously line number 5 will be printed again. Okay, so I can keep going and keep going and keep going. All right, so obviously you notice that the render the app component was only printed once. So why is it only printed once and not multiple times? Well, that's because React realizes that nothing has changed. Right? I have not changed anything in here. So React will simply say there's no need to re-render, which means my application will be faster. Right? So React never re-renders the entire UI. It only re-renders what is exactly necessary. And in this instance, it's only the counter component that is necessary. Okay, now, one thing I like about React is the ability to reuse components. Okay, so notice I have my nice component called counter. And so what I can do now, I could reuse counter by simply creating a new counter component. Right? Easy as that. Now, because each component is independent, each component manages its own state. So let me refresh the page. Let me show that to you. All right. So we have, and I apologize for the noise. We have render the app component, render the counter component. Right. So if I click here, okay, obviously it's 1. And now if I click here, right, it's also 1. Right? And notice each component, each state is managed independently by that component. So they are essentially independent. And of course, if I wanted, I could add more counter components, and each one would manage its own state. Okay, so that is the proper way how to update state in a component. All right, so let's try to wrap up. All right, so again, right, each instance of a component manages its own state. And of course, we use the useState hook, whereby we call the useState function or hook. We have an initial value. This function returns 2 items. The first one is the actual state that we will use to keep track of the thing that changes, right? The thing that is dynamic, the thing that changes based on the user's interaction with our component, right? For example, maybe we have a box and a button, and when we click the button, we want to maybe call an API, and then the data that is returned from the API, we want to put that into the box. Okay, and so that box is currently empty, and then later on it could change to have something in there. So in that case, we would create a state variable that is used to manage the contents that is returned from the API. All right, hope that made sense. And finally, the second thing is simply the function that allows me to update the state. Okay, I'll leave it here. All right, we're going to be using state quite a lot, not only for these simple things here, but of course things like changing the UI based on data that has come from an HTTP request, right? An API. Changing the input box when a user is typing, right? So again, the key takeaway is if something is going to change based on the user interacting with our component, then that thing needs to be a piece of state. All right, I'll see you in the next video.